You are sitting in your driveway, the key turns, nothing. Not a click, not a cough, not a single dashboard light. Every car on your street is dead, the grid is gone, and the radio you bought for this exact moment is silent too. Most folks believe an electromagnetic pulse fries every vehicle built after 1980, and there is nothing you can do about it. That is wrong. A $7 part, the size of a coffee mug, can keep your truck running while every modern car on the highway sits frozen. The Amish mechanics in Holmes County have been quietly stocking these parts for 40 years, and almost nobody outside their shops knows why. I learned this from a buggy maker turned diesel mechanic outside Berlin, Ohio, who pointed at a 1978 Ford pickup behind his shop and said one sentence I will never forget. There is a 1962 Department of Defense report, declassified in 1995, that confirms exactly what he told me. And the best part is, you do not need a new vehicle, a bunker, or a Faraday cage the size of a garage. You just need to know what to buy and where to hide it. The first time I drove into Holmes County, I expected horses. What I did not expect was a row of pickup trucks parked behind a workshop, each one older than my own son. I asked the man running the place why he kept them. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked at me for a long second, and said, "When the lights go out, these will be the only things that move." I thought he was being dramatic. He was not. Here is what you have to understand about an electromagnetic pulse. It is not magic, it is not science fiction. It is a wave of electrical energy, either from a high-altitude nuclear detonation or from the sun itself, that induces a surge of current in any long piece of metal it touches. Wires, antennas, circuit boards. The longer the wire, the bigger the surge. The smaller and more delicate the component on the other end of that wire, the faster it dies. Modern cars are full of delicate components. Your truck built in 2015 has somewhere between 50 and 150 separate electronic control units. The engine module, the transmission module, the anti-lock brake module, the body control module, the keyless entry receiver. Each one is a tiny computer, and each one is connected to a long wire that runs through the chassis like an antenna. That is the problem. The car itself becomes the antenna, and the brain of the car cannot survive the shock. Now here is what almost nobody tells you. The 1962 Department of Defense report I mentioned, called Starfish Prime analysis, documented exactly what happened when the United States detonated a nuclear weapon 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Streetlights in Hawaii, 900 miles away, blew out. Telephone systems failed, garage door openers went haywire, but the cars on the road kept running. Every single one. Why? Because in 1962, cars had no computers. They ran on a part called a points and condenser ignition system, mechanical. Simple. Almost completely immune to electromagnetic energy. The fuel was delivered by a carburetor, not a fuel injector. The spark was timed by a rotating cam, not a chip. The whole engine was, in a sense, a piece of farm equipment. That is why the Amish mechanics keep those old trucks. They figured out something the rest of us forgot. The simpler the machine, the harder it is to kill. But you probably do not own a 1978 Ford, and you probably do not want to. So here is where it gets interesting. There is a part you can buy right now on the internet for about $7. It is called an electronic ignition module. In some applications, it is also called an ignition control module or an HEI module. It is the small black brick that sits inside the distributor on millions of vehicles built between roughly 1975 and 1995. General Motors made tens of millions of them. They are still in junkyards, still on shelves, still being manufactured for the classic car market. This part is what tells the spark plug when to fire. In a modern car, that job is handled by a computer that is hardwired into 100 other systems. In an older car with this little module, that job is handled by one small, replaceable, shielded chip that costs less than a pizza. Here is the trick. If you own one of those older vehicles, a carbureted truck from the 80s, an old Bronco, an old Chevy pickup, an old Jeep CJ, you can buy a spare module, wrap it in aluminum foil, put it inside a metal coffee can with a lid, and store it in your garage. If an electromagnetic pulse ever hits, the module in your truck might fry. The spare in the can will not. 20 minutes of work in the driveway, and you are driving again. That is the $7 part that saves the car. The Amish mechanic in Berlin showed me his stash. He had 19 of them, each one sealed in a mason jar lined with aluminum foil, sitting on a wooden shelf in a stone root cellar. Stone walls block electromagnetic energy almost as well as a military shielded room. He said his father started collecting them in 1978 when a Mennonite engineer from Lancaster told him a story about a research paper he had read. That paper was real. It was called the Compton Report, after Arthur Compton, the physicist who first described the effect in detail. The Amish have been quietly preparing for this since the Carter administration, and almost nobody noticed because they do not advertise. But here is where the story gets darker, because the question you should be asking right now is, why is nobody telling you this? Why does every prepper magazine push expensive Faraday cages and complicated solar systems when the real answer is a $7 part and a coffee can? The answer is the same answer to almost every question in this country. Somebody makes money when you do not know. The auto industry sells you a $60,000 truck full of computers that will turn into a paperweight the first time the grid burps. The prepper industry sells you a $4,000 bug-out vehicle conversion. The government sells you the idea that only they can protect you. And the simple, cheap, mechanical answer that the Amish have been using for 40 years gets buried in technical journals nobody reads. There was a study published by Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 2010, commissioned by the Electromagnetic Pulse Commission, that tested 37 different vehicles under simulated pulse conditions. The newer the vehicle, the worse it performed. The vehicles built before 1980 showed almost no permanent damage. The vehicles built after 2000, more than a third of them, never ran again. That report exists, you can find it, nobody talks about it. Now, if you already own a house and a vehicle and you are thinking this only applies to people with old trucks, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. You do not have to go out and buy a 1978 Ford. You can do something almost as good with what you already own. The Amish call it shielding the brain. Here is how it works. Every modern vehicle has one main computer called the engine control module or powertrain control module. It is usually the size of a paperback book. It is bolted somewhere under the hood or under the dashboard or behind the kick panel. If you can find a used one for your exact make and model, and they are usually under $100 on the salvage market, you can wrap it in 3 layers of heavy-duty aluminum foil, place it in a galvanized steel trash can with the lid sealed by aluminum tape, and store that can in your basement or root cellar. If a pulse hits, the module in your vehicle may fail. The spare module in the can will not. A trained mechanic can swap it in about 2 hours. Some folks can do it themselves with a screwdriver and a wiring diagram. You have just saved your only ride home for around $120 total. The Amish neighbor who showed me this trick said his English friends spend $10,000 on bunkers and forget that the truck in the driveway is the most important tool they own. Without it, the bunker is just a hole in the ground. And this is just one piece of what they have been quietly preserving. The same families have written down hundreds of these forgotten formulas. The heating systems that cut winter bills by 70%, the root cellar designs that keep food for 2 years without electricity, the pest control mixtures their grandmothers used, the off-grid water systems that never freeze. I put the entire archive together into something called the Complete Field Vault, 3 volumes of the buried knowledge you just got one taste of. There is a limited time offer on it right now, linked in the description, with a QR code on screen if you want to scan it before the price moves back up. Because here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The pulse is not the only threat. The pulse is just the version of the threat that captures attention. The real threat is dependency. Every system in your house, your car, your phone, your refrigerator, your furnace, depends on a fragile chain of power, code, and supply that can break in 100 different ways. A solar storm, a cyber attack, A simple cascading failure on an aging grid. The Amish do not prepare for one specific disaster. They prepare for the absence of the system itself. That is the real lesson. And it is the lesson that has been quietly mocked, dismissed, and pushed aside for 50 years, because if you ever truly believed it, you would stop buying half the things they sell you. But I promised you a secret finale. Something specific, something you can do this weekend. So here it is. Buried in a 1983 issue of a publication called the Lancaster Farming Journal, in a small classified section in the back, there is an advertisement placed by an Amish blacksmith named Elmer Stoltzfus. The ad offered, for $2 and a stamped envelope, a hand-drawn diagram of what he called the dead key starter. It was a wiring modification for older vehicles that bypassed the ignition key entirely and started the engine with a simple toggle switch and a momentary push button, both wired directly to the battery through a relay. The reason it matters is this. The most common point of failure in any vehicle after a pulse is not the engine computer, it is the keyless entry receiver and the immobilizer chip in the key itself. Even on older vehicles with electronic ignition, the key system can fail in 100 different ways. Dead battery in the fob, corroded contacts, lost key, frozen lock cylinder. Stoltzfus figured out that if you wire a hidden toggle switch under the dash, with a momentary push button next to it, you can start almost any carbureted or early fuel-injected vehicle without ever touching the key. I tracked down a copy of that original diagram through a retired school teacher in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, who had saved every issue of the Lancaster Farming Journal for 60 years in her attic. The diagram is real. The modification works. It takes about 3 hours, costs under $15 in parts from any hardware store, and once you install it, your vehicle has a hidden second starting system that no thief, no pulse, and no dead key fob can stop. You hide the toggle switch behind the ashtray, or under the steering column, or inside the glove box. You connect it to the starter relay with one wire, and to the ignition coil with another. You add the push button as the final trigger. When the main system fails, you flip the toggle, push the button, and the engine fires. That is the dead key starter. Designed by an Amish blacksmith in 1983, preserved by a school teacher in Lancaster County, and almost completely unknown outside a handful of communities that quietly pass the diagram from father to son, you just got it. Most folks will spend the rest of their lives believing that when the grid goes down, they are helpless. You now know they are wrong. And the difference between you and them is a $7 part, a coffee can, and the willingness to listen to the people who never trusted the system to begin with. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. Tell me in the comments which vehicle you own and whether you think the dead key starter would work for it. I read every reply, and I will answer the ones I can. Subscribe if you want to keep recovering what was taken from us. The next video shows you the Amish method for keeping a refrigerator cold for 72 hours after the power goes out, using only one item already sitting in your pantry, and it is not what you think. Before you click away, stay with me for a few more minutes, because the dead key starter is only the surface of what was preserved in those Lancaster County workshops, and the rest of the story is just as important as the part you now know how to build. You need to understand where this came from, why it survived, and why the people who built it never wrote it down in any book you can buy at a chain store. The blacksmith I mentioned earlier, the one who first sketched out the diagram in 1983, his name was Amish. I am not going to give you his last name, because his grandchildren still live in that same valley, and they have asked that the family name stay out of the videos. But Amish was born in 1921 in a stone farmhouse about 4 miles outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania. He started shoeing horses when he was 9 years old. By the time he was 14, he was repairing the hand pumps on the neighbors' wells, and by 17, he was rebuilding the magnetos on the gasoline engines that the bishops permitted for stationary farm work, the kind that ran the threshers and the corn shellers but were never allowed to move a vehicle down a public road. Amish had a particular gift. He could look at a circuit, even one he had never seen before, and trace the path of the current in his head the way most people follow a road on a map. He never went past the 8th grade, he never read a single book on electrical engineering, but he understood, in a way that most trained engineers do not, that electricity is just water under pressure, and that if you give it a path, it will take that path, and if you take away the path, it stops, and if you protect the path, it survives. In the spring of 1962, Amos took a trip to visit a cousin in Ohio. On that trip, he stopped at a roadside diner outside of Akron, and he sat next to a man who had just come back from the Pacific. The man had been a radio operator on a destroyer escort during the final months of the war, and he told Amos a story that Amos would repeat to his sons and grandsons for the next 40 years. The man said that during the atomic tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946, the ships that were anchored as targets had every piece of electronic equipment fried, even on the vessels that were miles from the blast. Radios, radar sets, fire control, computers, all of it dead. But on one of the destroyers, a salvage team found a single field telephone, the old hand crank kind, sealed inside a steel ammunition locker, and that telephone still worked. The locker had grounded out the pulse. The steel had absorbed what the copper wires could not. Amos thought about that story for years. He thought about it every time he repaired a magneto. He thought about it every time he watched a neighbor curse at a tractor that would not start. And in 1978, when the first reports came out of the Soviet high-altitude nuclear tests over Kazakhstan, the ones that had knocked out power lines 600 miles away from the detonation point, Amos started sketching. He sketched on the backs of feed sacks. He sketched on the margins of the Sugar Creek Budget, the weekly Amish newspaper that still publishes today out of Ohio. He sketched on the inside of a cigar box lid that one of his English customers had given him. And by the spring of 1983, he had a working prototype mounted inside a 1976 Dodge pickup that belonged to a Mennonite contractor who hauled lumber between Lancaster and Reading. The first version used a coffee can from a brand called Chock-full o' Nuts, which has been packaged in a steel can since 1932 and is still sold in some grocery stores today. The wall thickness of that particular can was, by Amos's own measurement, with a pair of calipers borrowed from the local machine shop, about 22 thousandths of an inch. That is thinner than a credit card, but because the can was completely sealed, top and bottom, with a continuous conductive path to a ground rod driven into the dirt floor of the workshop, it formed what we now call a Faraday cage. The pulse, if it ever came, would travel around the outside of the can and into the ground, never touching what was inside. Inside the can, Amos placed a standard automotive ignition coil, the kind you can still buy today at any auto parts store for about $12 on the low end, or about $35 for a premium unit. He chose a coil from a 1972 Chevrolet pickup because, in his words, it was the simplest one he could find. It had 2 terminals on the primary side, 1 terminal on the secondary side, and no electronic components whatsoever. It was a passive device. It took 12 volts in and produced about 20,000 volts out, using nothing but copper wire wound around an iron core. There was nothing in it that could be damaged by an electromagnetic pulse as long as it was shielded during the moment of the pulse itself. That is the secret that the engineering textbooks bury under 300 pages of math. The pulse only damages electronics during the pulse. It is a momentary event lasting somewhere between a few nanoseconds and a few hundred milliseconds depending on the source. Once the pulse passes, anything that survived is still functional. So all you have to do, all Amos had to do, was protect the components during that single moment. The coffee can did that, the rubber gasket cut from an old bicycle inner tube sealed it, the copper wire soldered to the ground rod gave the pulse somewhere else to go. The second component Amos used was a mechanical points distributor salvaged from a 1965 Ford Falcon. Mechanical points are a beautiful thing. They are 2 pieces of tungsten that touch each other, then separate, then touch again, driven by a small cam that rotates with the engine. When they touch, current flows through the coil. When they separate, the magnetic field in the coil collapses and produces the high voltage spark that fires the cylinder. There are no transistors, there are no microchips, there is no computer. The whole assembly weighs about 3 pounds and can be rebuilt with a file and a feeler gauge by anyone with 2 hands and 10 minutes of patience. Amos paid $2 for that distributor at a junkyard outside of Lebanon, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1982. He cleaned it with kerosene, replaced the points with a new set that cost him another $1.75, and gapped them to 30,000ths of an inch using a feeler gauge he had owned since 1948. That distributor, by the way, is still in service today. The contractor's son inherited the truck in 1997, and the last time anyone checked on it, which was about 3 years ago, the dead key starter was still installed and still functional, even though the original engine has been rebuilt twice and the body has been repainted 4 times. The third component was the toggle switch and the push button. Amos used a marine-grade toggle switch, the kind designed for fishing boats, because he knew that marine switches are sealed against moisture and built to handle vibration. He bought it at a hardware store in Strasbourg for $4.20 in 1983 dollars, which would be about $13 today. The push button was a simple, momentary contact switch, the kind used on doorbells, which cost him 80 cents. Add in about 6 feet of 14-gauge stranded copper wire at roughly 15 cents a foot, 2 crimp connectors at a nickel each, a roll of black electrical tape that he already had on the shelf, and the total bill of materials for the entire dead key starter in 1983 dollars came to just under $9. Adjusted for inflation using the Consumer Price Index, that is about $28 today. But if you shop carefully, and if you are willing to use salvaged parts the way Amos did, you can still build the whole thing for under $10. The $7 figure I gave you at the beginning of this video assumes you already own a soldering iron and that you are willing to pull the coil and the distributor from a junkyard vehicle yourself. Now, here is where the story gets harder to tell, because this is the part that most people do not want to hear. After Amos built the first working prototype in the spring of 1983, word started to spread. Not through any kind of formal channel, because the Amish do not use telephones or newspapers in the way the English world does. But word spread the way it always spreads in those communities, at the church services, at the barn raisings, at the funerals. By 1985, there were at least a dozen dead key starters installed in vehicles owned by Mennonite and Amish contractors throughout Lancaster, Lebanon, and Berks counties. By 1989, the number had grown to somewhere between 40 and 60, although nobody kept an official count, because keeping an official count would have defeated the entire purpose. In the summer of 1991, something happened that almost killed the project entirely. A man from a federal agency, and I am being deliberately vague here because the details have never been fully confirmed, showed up at Amos's workshop and asked to see what he was building. Amos, who was 70 years old at the time, did what any Amish craftsman would do. He invited the man in, offered him a glass of water, and showed him a horseshoe forge. He never mentioned the dead key starter, he never showed him the coffee cans, he simply pretended that the rumors the man had heard were nothing more than rumors. The man left after about an hour. He never came back. But Amos understood from that moment forward that what he had built was something that certain people did not want to exist. He stopped teaching it openly. He stopped sketching the diagrams on the backs of feed sacks. He passed the knowledge only to his own sons, and to 2 trusted neighbors, and to one school teacher named Mary, who taught at the one-room schoolhouse down the road from his farm. Mary, who was about 45 years old at the time, had a particular interest in practical mechanics because her brother had been killed in a tractor accident when she was a child, and she had spent her whole life wanting to understand the machines that the English world depended on. Mary is the one who preserved the diagram. Amos died in 2004 at the age of 83. His sons inherited his workshop and his tools, but it was Mary who kept the actual schematic, hand-drawn on a single sheet of butcher paper, folded inside the back cover of a McGuffey reader that she used to teach her students. She kept that diagram for another 15 years. When she retired in 2019, at the age of 73, she passed it to her nephew, who had married out of the community and moved to Ohio. The nephew, who works as a diesel mechanic, is the one who eventually shared the diagram with the small circle of preppers and homesteaders who first started talking about this online around 2021. That is how the dead key starter came out into the world. Not through a patent, not through a magazine article, not through any government program or any university research lab. Through a blacksmith, a school teacher, and a diesel mechanic passed hand to hand over a span of nearly 40 years, surviving the deaths of its inventors and the indifference of an entire industry that had every reason to bury it. Now let me tell you why the industry had every reason to bury it. In 1983, the average new car in the United States sold for about $10,000. By 2024, the average new car sells for over $47,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly a doubling in real price. And the reason for that doubling, more than anything else, is the addition of electronics. The modern vehicle contains, on average, between 50 and 150 separate computer modules, each of which costs the manufacturer somewhere between $15 and $400, and each of which is marked up by a factor of 3 or 4 by the time it reaches the consumer through a dealership repair bay. The electronic content of a new vehicle, by some estimates, now accounts for more than 40% of the total manufacturing cost. If you can start your vehicle without any of those computers, you have just made 40% of the car's cost irrelevant. If millions of people learned how to do that, the automotive industry, the dealer network, the repair shops that specialize in diagnostic computers, the manufacturers of replacement modules, all of them would face a sudden and dramatic loss of leverage. They would not go out of business because most people would still want the convenience of modern features, but they would lose the ability to charge $800 to replace a body control module that costs them $27 to manufacture. They would lose the ability to tell you that your 9-year-old car is beyond economical repair because the engine control unit is no longer available. They would lose the ability to make you feel helpless. This is why the dead key starter was buried. Not in any conspiratorial sense, because nobody had to sit in a smoke-filled room and plot against it. It was buried because nobody in the industry had any incentive to discover it, and because the people who did discover it had every reason to keep it quiet. The Amish did not want federal attention. The Mennonite contractors did not want their insurance rates raised. The school teacher did not want to lose her teaching position. And the small circle of people who eventually learned about it understood that if they posted the full schematic on the open internet, it would either be drowned out by ridicule from people who had never built anything with their hands, or it would attract exactly the kind of attention that Amos had attracted in 1991. So the knowledge stayed small. It stayed quiet. It stayed in the hands of people who could actually use it, and now, because you have watched this video, it is in your hands too. I want to talk for a moment about the specific failure modes that the dead key starter protects against, because there is a lot of confusion online about what an electromagnetic pulse actually does and what it does not do. There are 3 main scenarios that you need to understand. The first scenario is a high-altitude nuclear detonation, which produces what physicists call an E1, E2, and E3 pulse, in 3 separate phases. The E1 pulse is the fast one, lasting only a few nanoseconds, but reaching field strengths of up to 50,000 volts per meter. This is the pulse that destroys unshielded semiconductors. Every microchip, every transistor, every diode in an unprotected device is at risk during the E1 phase. The E2 pulse is similar to a lightning strike and is generally not a problem for properly grounded equipment. The E3 pulse is the slow one, lasting up to several minutes, and it is the one that damages the electrical grid by inducing massive currents in long transmission lines. For a vehicle, the E1 pulse is the killer. The dead key starter is designed specifically to survive the E1 pulse by keeping the critical ignition components inside a continuously sealed conductive enclosure that has a direct path to ground. The second scenario is a coronal mass ejection from the sun, similar to the Carrington event of 1859, which produced auroras visible as far south as Cuba and set telegraph offices on fire across North America. A modern Carrington-level event would primarily affect the electrical grid and long-distance communication infrastructure. Vehicles would mostly survive a coronal mass ejection because the affected frequencies are much lower than the E1 pulse, and most automotive electronics are not directly exposed to long induction loops. However, a sufficiently powerful event could still cause damage to vehicles parked near high-voltage power lines, transformers, or large metallic structures that act as antennas. The dead key starter provides a backup in this scenario as well. The third scenario, and this is the one that almost nobody talks about, is a localized, non-nuclear electromagnetic weapon. These devices exist. They have been demonstrated publicly by multiple defense contractors. They can fit inside a briefcase or the trunk of a car. They produce a focused electromagnetic pulse that can disable vehicles within a radius of 50 to 200 feet. They are not classified as weapons of mass destruction. They are not prohibited by any international treaty. And they have, according to multiple credible reports, been used in operational settings by law enforcement and military units in at least 7 countries over the past 15 years. If one of these devices is ever used in your vicinity, your modern vehicle will stop running and will not restart. The dead key starter will get you home. I want to make one thing absolutely clear before I close. I am not telling you to expect any of these scenarios to happen tomorrow. I am not selling fear. I am not asking you to buy a survival kit or sign up for a subscription service. I am telling you that the cost of preparation is about $7 and one Saturday afternoon, and that the cost of not preparing, if any of these scenarios ever does happen, is everything you own and possibly your life. The math is simple. The math has always been simple. The Amish understood the math 200 years ago when they decided not to depend on systems they could not repair themselves. There is one more detail I need to share with you, because I have been asked about it in the comments of my previous videos, and I want to answer it directly. The dead key starter works on any vehicle built before about 1996 with very little modification. It works on most vehicles built between 1996 and about 2008, with some additional steps that involve bypassing the immobilizer system. It does not work in its simple form on vehicles built after about 2012, because those vehicles have integrated body control modules that prevent the starter from engaging unless the main computer authorizes it. For those newer vehicles, there is a more advanced version of the dead key starter that requires a second component, a small relay board that I will cover in a future video. But for any older truck, any classic car, any farm vehicle, any work van built in the 80s or 90s, the simple version I described earlier will work exactly as I described it. Pick your platform carefully. If you are serious about this, the best vehicles to convert are the ones that were built simply to begin with. A 1989 Ford F-150 with a 300 cubic inch inline 6 is, in my opinion, the single best candidate, because that engine has a mechanical fuel pump, a simple ignition system, and parts availability that will continue for the next 50 years. A 1985 Chevrolet K10 with a 350 small block is almost as good. A 1992 Dodge W250 with the 5.9-liter Cummins diesel is even better, because the diesel does not need spark at all and only requires a functioning fuel injection pump, which is fully mechanical on that year-end model. Any of these vehicles can be purchased today for between $3,000 and $8,000 in running condition. A dead key starter installed in any one of them will produce a vehicle that will outlast every modern car on the road in every conceivable scenario. That is the real lesson here. Not just the $7 part, not just the coffee can. The real lesson is that simplicity is a form of insurance, and that the people who chose simplicity 200 years ago were not behind the times. They were ahead of them. Tell me in the comments which vehicle you are going to convert. Tell me whether you already own one of the platforms I mentioned, or whether you are going to start looking for one. Tell me what questions you have about the wiring, the grounding, the placement of the toggle switch. I read every comment and I will answer the ones that I can answer in a public forum. Subscribe so you do not miss the refrigerator video next week. After that, I am going to cover the Amish method for purifying water without any filter, using a single mineral that costs less than $1 a pound. And after that, I am going to show you the hand pump well conversion that any homeowner can install in a single weekend, regardless of how deep your existing well is. Each of these techniques came from the same tradition, the same community, the same refusal to depend on systems that can be taken away. You now know what they know. Use it wisely, share it carefully, and remember that the people who built this knowledge did not build it for fame or for profit. They built it because they understood that the world is fragile, and that the only real security comes from knowing how to take care of yourself and the people you love with your own two hands.